So I'll hand over now to Argy to introduce himself and just say a little bit about the background to this particular calibration of the model. So we take the same model and we just calibrate it for different settings.
Hi everyone, I'm Argy. I'm 17 and I'm a high school student living in London. So just to give some context about the model, I used the model to initialize it for initially for Jakarta and then other cities in Indonesia to get a better picture of the situation there. So in Jakarta, we initialized it and made an estimate as to what was going on in terms of people currently infected, even those without any symptoms. And then once we did that, we realized that the extent of the situation in Indonesia goes beyond that because in 20 days at the end of Ramadan, people typically leave the cities such as Jakarta and go back to their hometowns to visit families. And so we modeled the influx of people leaving Jakarta to a city in Sumatra called Medan and a city in central Java called Tegal. And based on our results there, when we estimate it for the national scale and the national demographics, it projected up to 700,000 deaths across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Argy. Just to clarify why we invited Argy to do this, we wanted to impress upon you that this is not something that is beyond the capabilities of Argy. Is arguably a very talented 17-year-old, but he's very much like lots of other 17-year-olds all around the world who can pick this up and run with it. And there are other students like him doing this in other locations in the U.S., also around Europe and Asia. So in Jakarta, which is, I think that Kim is going to dive into the model quite soon here, the situation is that there were just a couple thousand cases that had been identified. And the first thing Argy did was he wanted to know how many people would be leaving the city infected. So that was the first step. And to set up the model for Jakarta, this is what you did. You might as well tell them, Argy.
Oh, yeah, sure. So we put in the data for the population by age group because age is a factor in the mortality rates for COVID-19 infections. So once we did that, the model gave an estimate as to the number of cases in Jakarta, even those that are unknown. And on the chart to the left, it shows a peak of confirmed new cases per day to up to 7,000. And the chart to the right shows that if the government does nothing, by the end, there will be 25,000 deaths in Jakarta alone.
So the charts that are outlined in the red are interesting. They represent data that most people have. The ones that aren't outlined in red are equally, if not more interesting, because they represent things that people don't have much data for and are actually crucial for a strategy. Susceptible uninfected people is something that is not tracked typically. Current active cases is tracked. Those are people who are infected, but it also includes people outside the hospital, and that number is not typically well understood or known. And the total number of people infected at the bottom there, it shows it peaks at around 3 million. So that's 1/3 of the population of Jakarta. That number is not typically estimated by most of the tools we've seen. And it's very, very important for this particular case because many of those people are leaving Jakarta at the end of Ramadan. And the government's trying to stop them and persuade them not to. Said this is how it was for us.
So the charts you're seeing over to the upper right, those are the charts that correspond with what we just showed you in the slideshow, except that these charts are now on the basis of government policy. So this lockdown is the lockdown plan that they had at that time, and you can see that results in a pause in the takeoff of confirmed new cases and a follow-on pause in the rate at which deaths take off. But the most important thing for us is to be able to explore policies and options for actually doing something about this.
Yeah, just a clarification, the red line represents the new government policy. Originally, it was a 14-day lockdown. It's been extended to the end of Ramadan to try and prevent people from traveling. So what we've done is we've looked at different ways that the government could run things going forward. And these scenarios were developed in conjunction with people living in Jakarta, Argy's family, in fact. So the first one they asked was, well, what if we gradually release the lockdown after 14 days? And, what happens then? And we implement that. If you can just click on the words there, after 14 days release lockdown, you'll see the change to the red line in the scenario. It ramps up slowly after 14 days. And the answer is things get worse. You can see that it just advances things. The peak is higher, it comes faster, and there's less time to deal with it. The next one was, well, we have an awful lot of people in the hospital, way more than we can accommodate, and a lot of them are being kicked out and sent home. What can we do about that? We said, all right, well, what if we were able to magically get people to limit the contacts per day so that we can first initially release them into hospital and then clamp down again straight afterwards to prevent too many from coming in. And as they feed through, then gradually release over time to flatten the curve, as you see there in the green line. That has a big impact on the number of deaths all the way on the right. You see that the number of deaths come down significantly from a total of 20,000 to about 16,000. That's good. That's in the right direction. But then the next question, what else can we do? And just as a baseline, we said, all right, well, how would it look if we just continued this lockdown indefinitely? And that looks pretty good in terms of the number of deaths. On the right, hardly anybody dies. It's just really what's happened already. But the double-edged sword here is that still almost everybody in Jakarta is still susceptible. Looks a bit like Hong Kong. Then we tried, well, what about another experiment, just isolating the old people to see if they are the source of the problem here. And we did that, and sure enough, it is a big source of the problem. If you just do that alone and let them hide away while the worst part of the outbreak is happening, the number of deaths drops down to about 10,000 or 11,000. And something quite like herd immunity happens over there with susceptibles. And then finally, we thought, okay, let's combine these and see if we can do even better. And sure enough, it is better. By isolating the vulnerable and keeping too many people from going to the hospital, the whole thing happens a bit more slowly. It runs on for another 100 days or so before we hit the end of it. But we save a lot of lives. We save something like 12,000 people from dying. That's just in Jakarta. If there's people traveling across Indonesia, there's a more than proportional impact. The high end of our estimates was 700,000. It's a lot less. We're probably in the low 100,000s